Olá, começa agora o Café com Política Internacional. Você pode escolher assistir a esta edição na versão original ou com tradução simultânea. São 2 posts aí no YouTube e no Facebook. Bem, hoje em dia, quando falamos de políticas públicas, é natural pensarmos na participação dos economistas, calculando o custo-benefício de tudo, seja se estamos falando de controle orçamentário, investimentos em educação ou de desenvolvimento sustentável. Tudo passa pela lógica do dinheiro. Mas nem sempre foi assim. Houve uma época em que os economistas eram vistos como mero matemáticos. Mas quando isso mudou, o que aconteceu? Quais as consequências disso? Para responder a essa e outras perguntas, o Café com Política entrevista o jornalista e escritor norte-americano, integrante do conselho editorial do jornal The New York Times, Binyamin Appelbaum. Ele é autor do livro The Economists Hour, False Prophets, Free Markets and the Fracture of Society. Enriquece a nossa conversa o jornalista brasileiro, ex-ministro da Comunicação Social, Thomas Traumann. Ele é autor do livro O Pior Emprego do Mundo. 14 ministros da Fazenda contam como tomaram as decisões que mudaram o Brasil e mexeram no seu bolso. O vice-presidente do Sindilegis e servidor do Tribunal de Contas da União, Alison Souza, também participa dessa conversa. Bem, eu vou começar pedindo para Binyamin Appelbaum falar um pouco do seu livro, quando os economistas ganharam tanta influência na formulação das políticas públicas e quais as consequências para a sociedade.
Well, it's great to be with you. It would be even greater to be there in person, but one of the nice things I'm discovering in this new coronavirus era is how easy it is to travel around the world and on Zoom and talk to people in other places. And so I'm glad that we can make that happen this evening. My book, The Economists Hour, is a history of a revolution that I think was enormously important and underappreciated. Beginning in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, first in the United States and then spreading around the world, economists began to assume a new and greater importance in public policy, in the shaping and making of public policy. And this was in particular true of a new group of economists, advocates of a reliance on free markets, on the substitution of the marketplace for the traditional role of government in society. The rise of the economists, the story of how they rose, which is the subject of the book, is a story that I think many people don't know because we live now in a world in which economic ideas are so prevalent and economists are so central to decision-making and public policy debate that it can be easy to forget how recently that changed and how new the rise of the economists is. I actually begin my book with the story of a young American economist working in New York in the bowels of the Federal Reserve in the 1950s. And this young man came home to his wife one evening and told her that he didn't see any future for an economist at the Central Bank of the United States, that he didn't think he could make a career at the central bank, that all of the people who ran the bank at that time, none of them were economists, and there was no prospect for an economist to join them. That young man was named Paul Volcker, and by the late 1970s, he was the head of the central bank here in the United States. And today, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, is the world's single largest employer of credentialed economists. And that transformation from a time when an economist was just a human calculator who had no prospect of participating in policymaking, to a point where economists run many, if not most, of the world's central banks, are certainly heavily employed at those institutions, and are involved in a wide range of other areas of policy, is really the story of my book. So why did that happen? Well, it happened because in the post-war years, there was a period of relative prosperity, rising affluence, and people were generally content with the administration of government policy. But by the 1960s, the late 1960s here in the United States, that confidence was breaking down. Economic growth was beginning to slow, social unrest was on the rise, and policymakers began to look around for new answers to problems like rising inflation and simultaneously rising unemployment, the decline of manufacturing as manufacturing moved to other regions and other countries. And they turned to a group of economists who argued that these problems could be solved and prosperity could be restored if policymakers would simply embrace markets, if they would use markets to allocate resources, to determine who got paid and how much, to determine the prices of goods and services, to step back from regulating and allow companies to compete, as it were, in an open marketplace, that this would solve the problems of society, that it would revitalize growth, increase prosperity, and that everyone would benefit from this turn toward markets. And so here in the United States, where this revolution began, we saw the government pulling out of its traditional role in regulating, for example, the price of airline tickets, or the price of carrying freight from one city to another, or the price of a long-distance phone call. We saw the government pulling back from managing the value of the exchange rate of the United States dollar with foreign currencies, which had been an instrumental role of American foreign policy for the quarter century after World War II. And then one day in 1973, the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, went on television and announced that the United States was no longer going to do that. It was no longer going to manage the exchange rate of the dollar against other currencies. And this was symptomatic of an era in which the government was pulling back from its traditional role in managing various parts of the economy and allowing markets to come forward. This was widely popular at the time. Economists of all stripes endorsed this turn to greater or lesser extents as necessary to address the problems that a post-industrial society, or a society where industry was in decline, was beginning to confront. And by the 1980s, they were pressing the argument that other countries would benefit from the same set of answers, that the countries that were still in the process of industrializing would benefit from the same answers as a country like the United States, where industrialization already had peaked, that lower income countries would benefit from the same set of policy prescriptions as higher income countries, that countries that were still struggling to establish democracy on a sound footing would benefit from the same economic policies as countries where democracy was more entrenched. And they were quite successful in forcing countries around the world and in persuading countries around the world to adopt these policies. And so what began in the United States spread as a set of prescriptions and policies, sometimes called the Washington Consensus, to countries around the world, often as the price of aid from the developed world. So what has happened over the last half century as governments have embraced this turn toward markets, have urged people to take responsibility for their own lives and not to depend on government, have reduced regulations so that companies can compete with each other? Well, I think there have been three big changes as a result of the Economists' Hour. The first is that the promise that the economy would grow more quickly failed to materialize. We have not moved into an age of new prosperity and abundance. Rather, across the developed world, growth has slowed. And to the extent that it has increased in the developing world, it has often been a form of growth that greatly exacerbates inequality. It's a form of growth that relies on the stripping of commodities and their shipment to the factories of China. And it tends to enrich the few who own those commodities and not the masses who labor to produce them. The second great change is inequality. We have seen a compression in inequality among nations, but within nations, we've seen dramatic increases in the disparity between rich and poor. Within each nation, the distribution of resources has grown more unequal. And the final consequence, which is related to that, is that unequal societies struggle to sustain democratic governments. Democracy really requires a commonality of interest. It requires people to be able to speak in a common language about their needs and their challenges, and to identify solutions that they have in common. And in a society where the disparity between rich and poor grows too great, what you see is that the rich began to seek what economists called rents, which means basically charging for the use of resources, and the poor increasingly rely on the state for help and aid, and the type of pro-growth policies that a state can genuinely administer, investments in infrastructure and education, sensible regulation of the marketplace, become difficult, if not impossible. And as people lose faith in government, support for democracy comes under great strain. Here in the United States, we are acutely experiencing that kind of strain under the current president, Donald Trump. And other countries, Brazil among them, seem similarly vexed by a sense that the economy is not working for anyone, and therefore that government of, by, and for the people is an increasingly difficult and fraught proposition. It is my conviction, and the case that I make in this book, that our turn toward markets and our embrace of economists, while it has produced some real benefits, has gone too far and is at the center of the challenges that we are facing. And that a turn away from, not away from markets so much as a firmer grasp on markets, a recognition that markets are social structures that we must regulate and determine what we want from them, is necessary to restore broad-based prosperity and ultimately to restore our ability to govern ourselves. So that's an overview of the Economists Hour, and I look forward to the discussion this evening.
Obrigada, Binyamin, pelas palavras iniciais. Bem, nós estamos com um problema na tradução simultânea. Nós continuamos aqui no canal original, em inglês, que você pode acompanhar. Esperamos resolver em breve esse problema para quem também quer assistir pela tradução simultânea. Eu vou passar a palavra para o Thomas Traumann agora para a sua pergunta, mas antes eu queria aproveitar aqui com uma provocação, porque no livro, no seu livro, Thomas, você fala justamente dessa força dos ministros da Fazenda, chamando-os de primeiro-ministro. Você também colabora dessa importância da influência dos economistas aqui no Brasil, também teve força aqui no Brasil, como nos narrou Appelbaum, e aí segue a sua pergunta também, por favor.
Bom, é um prazer. Bem, sim, eu acho que só vou pegar um caso anedótico, mas que mostra muito bem a importância dos economistas no Brasil, é o fato de que na última campanha eleitoral você teve um debate sobre economia, quer dizer, não só com o debate dos candidatos a presidente, mas você teve um debate entre os assessores econômicos de todos os candidatos. Quer dizer, isso mostra claramente que, além da questão política de cada candidato, ele tinha que também demonstrar qual era o seu candidato a ministro da Fazenda e o que ele pretendia, né? Na mesma época, o Paulo Guedes, que viria a ser o ministro da Economia, era a capa da revista Veja na mesma semana, ou seja, como a pessoa queria dar o aval para o Bolsonaro. Acho que isso ilustra um pouco bem essa importância que o ministro da Economia tem no Brasil e como a nossa vida pública é baseada na economia. Eu queria começar a minha pergunta olhando um pouquinho para o começo da história brasileira. A história brasileira tem várias, assim como fora, várias econômicas, mas existe uma linha liberal muito clara, uma família liberal de economistas liberais. Uma característica é que quase todos eles, dos grandes economistas liberais brasileiros, acabaram trabalhando para presidentes autoritários, fosse os governos militares, como hoje o governo Jair Bolsonaro. Eu queria entender o que você falou sobre essa aparente contradição entre pessoas que são liberais no mercado, pró-mercado, porém trabalham para governos que não são democráticos.
It clearly is a contradiction I regard as vexing, but that many of these economists have long seemed very comfortable with. And I think at its core, it boils down to a question of how people understand freedom. What is meant by liberty, what is meant by freedom, what they value. And for many of these economists, the right to own property and to control property has long figured as the supreme civil right. They have long taken the view that a society prospers and benefits in the long run from a fairly strict regulation of property rights, from a fairly strict emphasis on property rights, that if you protect the ability of people to accumulate wealth and to acquire resources, in their view, that will ultimately provide people with the freedom to make their own decisions and to live life in their own way. And there's something about this, it's not a completely crazy idea. There is obviously some basic truth to the idea that, freedom in the sense of, the freedom to make choices, the freedom to live where you want to worship as you want to speak as you want to. These freedoms really only have meaning if people have the economic means to make use of them. But this emphasis on property rights became so singular, so much the focus, that the other forms of freedom got lost in the shuffle. And so what you found is you had economists who were advocating for the importance of property rights and who were willing to sacrifice other forms of freedom in order to secure property rights, to make the case basically that we'll deal with the other stuff later. We don't need democracy now. We don't need free speech now. We don't need, any of these other freedoms now. What we need is property rights. What we need is to secure economic progress. And then on that foundation of economic progress, we can come back and restore to people their rights. And this is fundamentally misguided. I think what history has taught us is that if you surrender the rights in order to pursue profit, you end up with neither prosperity nor freedom.
E nesse sentido, precisamos do dinheiro para conseguirmos fazer todas as nossas coisas. Hoje, com a pandemia, é uma preocupação também essa questão financeira. Como medir isso? Como ter essa avaliação? Os economistas tentando mostrar os melhores meios para continuarmos gerando economia nesse momento de recessão e de desemprego, e, ao mesmo tempo, equilibrar com a desigualdade social que está agravada e piorada nesse momento da pandemia. Qual o espaço dos economistas aí?
So I think economists have an enormously important role to play. And I want to be clear about that. This book is not an argument for the exclusion of economists from public policy making. Economics is simply the word we use to describe the work of figuring out what to do in a world with limited resources. That is a problem that we cannot escape. And we need a language to talk about it. And economics is a very good language for framing choices and for comparing alternatives. And as you say, society faces a constant tension. It needs to be finding policies that will promote economic growth. It needs to be distributing resources in a way that will provide people with a good life. And market economies are the best system we've ever found for doing that. The 20th century provided us with an amazing experiment, a competition between two forms of economic organization. And I often, refer to the Korean Peninsula as sort of the encapsulation of that experiment. If you look at a satellite picture of the Korean Peninsula at night, what you will see is that the bottom half is illuminated. There is widespread use of electricity there, while the top half of the Korean Peninsula is completely dark. And that, in a nutshell, is the story of the 20th century, of the competition between communist forms of economic organization and capitalist forms of economic organization. South Korea's model emerged triumphant. And the lesson there is that we need markets. But, and this is a very important but, markets exist in the context of a state that regulates their function and that decides what to do with their output. And from the victory of capitalism over communism, a lot of experts, a lot of economists drew the lesson that you should just go completely in the direction of markets, that you should abandon regulation, that you should abandon redistribution, that you should stop worrying about taking care of poor people and just trust that if they worked hard enough, they'd be able to take care of themselves. And that was an overreaction. That was not the proper lesson to draw. And so we find ourselves today in this situation where both the economy as a whole is struggling and also many people in the economy are struggling. And there's a temptation to think we can get out of it by just, pursuing growth at all costs. And the truth is that the only way out of it is to ensure that we begin from a place of broadly shared prosperity. People need to believe that the system will work for them in order for them to participate in the system.
Ok. Alison tem uma pergunta. Alison, você está sem áudio. Deve estar fechado.
Agora sim. Desculpe. Desculpe. Muito bem. Curiosamente, agora em 2020, completou 50 anos desde a publicação do ensaio do economista Milton Friedman na The Times Magazine, que defendia que as empresas, na época, ele defendia que as empresas deveriam se abster de qualquer compromisso social, e focar apenas em um único objetivo, que é o lucro. A tese era de que se as corporações se concentrassem apenas em ganhar dinheiro e o governo saísse do caminho, não atrapalhasse, a economia cresceria e todos se beneficiariam. Bom, isso não aconteceu, pelo menos não aconteceu, ao menos da maneira imaginada. E em um artigo seu, Appelbaum, no mês passado, você comentou que agora, cada vez mais, nós tentamos cobrar o inverso das empresas, não é? E que esse seria um caminho errado, que o Estado é quem deveria ser o protagonista na mediação dessas relações. Afinal, a gente sabe que não existe jantar de graça. Você pode nos falar um pouco sobre isso?
The most important figure in this revolution that we've been talking about. He, more than anyone else, articulated the argument for the importance of markets and argued against using government and instead relying on markets. He was a wonderfully compelling public speaker, a person who dominated any room he entered, even though he was a very small and short man. He was a genius, and he had an idea that he spent his entire life arguing for. He joked that if the Sahara Desert was placed under the management of government bureaucrats, there would soon be a shortage of sand. And what he meant by that was that governments were bad at taking care of the economy, and they should get their hands off the economy. As you said, he wrote a very famous essay in my newspaper, the New York Times, 50 years ago, in which he argued that corporations should be solely focused on profitability. This was an extension of his broader view, that they should pursue profits, they should not engage in charitable work, they should not worry about trying to help the communities in which they operated, they should not worry about the quality of life of their employees, make as much money as possible, and everyone would benefit. That was his argument. It has become very fashionable for people to argue that Friedman was wrong and that the necessary corrective is for corporations to embrace a broader sense of social responsibility. And I want to be clear, I think that that's great to the extent that it works. If there are companies that are willing to voluntarily restrain pollution, to voluntarily pay employees higher wages or provide childcare for workers, that's fantastic. I think that's great. But I think we would be foolish to rely on corporations to voluntarily do the things that we as a society need corporations to do. Corporations are creatures of the state. They are grants of authority from the state to a particular group of people to operate a business that has some legal rights that aren't available to an ordinary person selling lemonade on their front porch. And corporations also have responsibilities, and those responsibilities need to be defined in law. If we want corporations to pollute less, we need to write laws that restrict pollution. If we want them to pay workers more, we need to write laws that require higher rates of pay. If we want corporations to take an interest in their communities, we need to find ways of incentivizing that behavior or penalizing bad behavior. It's simply not realistic to expect that corporations will do this for us. And Friedman was right that a corporation is fundamentally, in most cases, created as a vehicle for pursuing profit. And for the most part, we're all better off if corporations are allowed to focus on doing that within the context of carefully defined limitations and responsibilities that ensure that they are not able to do that at the expense of everyone else.
Desculpa, agora eu que fiquei com o meu microfone mudo. Thomas Traumann, por favor, a palavra com você.
Em relação à questão do mercado, quer dizer, o Brasil e a América Latina inteira têm uma relação ambivalente com o mercado. O Brasil quebrou várias vezes em função de enfrentar, vamos dizer assim, o mercado. Quando a gente fala qualquer coisa que vá em linha no Brasil, qualquer político fala em qualquer coisa que vá em termos de ação do mercado e de restrição algum tipo de liberdade sobre o mercado financeiro, você tem milhões de dólares que saem do país. Quer dizer, este ano mesmo, você teve uma saída de dólares do Brasil significativa, o real desvalorizou 40%, quer dizer, foi a moeda que mais valorizou no ano, em função da estabilidade política, mas em função dos temores internos e em função do mercado estar assustado. Quer dizer, o Brasil não é um país pequeno, mas o Brasil não tem a menor condição de enfrentar o mercado e regulá-lo. Como que isso pode acontecer? Quer dizer, ou seja, em que termos que a gente pode pensar num mercado menos poderoso e que afete tanto as economias de países menores e menos poderosos como o Brasil?
So I think these are very difficult questions, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend I'm not in the first place an expert on Brazil, and much greater minds than mine struggle with these questions. But I think it may be useful to step back and talk a little bit about, you know, the condition in which Brazil and many other developing nations found themselves in, 75 years ago. Now, after World War II, many nations were in a position of, having relatively young populations, the potential to industrialize, to prosper. They were all chasing the same goal, and they all saw the opportunity to get there. And they did it in different ways. And I think that when we look at the relative success of nations over this period, there are some interesting lessons that emerge. And there is a particular contrast between a number of nations in East Asia, which were significantly poorer than any countries in Latin America at the end of World War II, but which have since jumped over Latin America, developed much more quickly, become much more prosperous. And the nations of Latin America, which if you had asked people, you can go back and read people making this assessment here in the United States, looking out at the world after World War II and saying, where are the greatest opportunities? Where is growth likely to be the fastest? Everyone was betting on Latin America. People thought the answer was Brazil, Argentina, Chile. That's where they expected, the next industrialized nations to emerge. And with good reason. These were countries rich in natural resources, with relatively educated populations, with long-standing ties with first world markets. And there was an expectation that growth would surge in those places. And what happened instead, much to everyone's surprise, is that the countries that developed most quickly were on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. So what happened? Why? What was the difference? I don't think there's an easy or a perfect answer, but there are a couple of themes that emerge in the literature. One is that the East Asian countries were much more aggressive about redistributing land ownership and ensuring that people had, enough money to become entrepreneurs, to go into business, to pursue their dreams. Another is that they invested much more heavily in education. As a share of their economies, the East Asian nations spent much more money on education than Latin American countries did in that period, and on infrastructure, and on state support for manufacturing. Now, obviously, Latin America had its own experiments with state-backed manufacturing, varying degrees of success, but as a share of the economy, the East Asian nations were much more concerted in their efforts. And so you see a sort of a set of policy interventions that, played out more effectively in East Asia than in Latin America. And I would suggest that what they had in common was a recognition that the key to economic growth is ensuring that the population broadly, everyone, or as close to everyone as you can get, is in a position to realize their own abilities and to pursue opportunity. And when you have people in a position to do that collectively, everyone benefits.
Mas como distribuir essa riqueza, proporcionar uma educação, um investimento para toda a população, quando o país está quebrado? O Thomas falou de várias vezes que o país quebrou, porque aqui temos pavor da inflação. O Brasil já teve um momento de inflação a 80%. No seu livro você fala, começou falando inclusive do Paul Volcker, e ele conseguiu, num período difícil da história dos Estados Unidos, controlar a inflação do país, ali nos anos 80. Qual o exemplo de Paul Volcker que nós poderíamos adotar para não cairmos voltar na inflação que se teme hoje, e o que não deveríamos usar desse exemplo para não piorar as desigualdades que temos?
So one, specific, Paul Volcker brought inflation under control in the US, and it was devastating for Brazil and other Latin American nations, which, had in many cases assumed debts denominated in terms that made it impossible to repay. And so there was a banking crisis in Latin America triggered by Paul Volcker's success in the United States. I mention this because it underscores a very important dynamic, which is that different nations, their relative positions influence their ability to participate in the international economy. And the United States is in the particular position of being able to do things that other nations can't. Volcker was in a position to control inflation because he could essentially dictate terms to other nations. He could, because the dollar was the nearest thing to a global currency, and because debt around the world was denominated in dollars and people desperately wanted to hold dollars, because, and I always find this statistic astonishing, 75% of Korean imports and exports to and from countries other than the United States are denominated in dollars. Just to give you a sense of how dominant the dollar is as a global currency. That enables the United States to step on inflation in a way that is not possible for other nations. And so other nations labor at a disadvantage. But there are things that can be done differently. And one really important one element in Brazil's distress, and something that actually I think Brazilian policymakers now recognize, is that the emphasis, part of the market revolution we were talking about was an insistence that capital controls should be knocked down and that money should be free to move across borders. And the proponents of markets argued, as they argued about everything, that more freedom was better. And if money could just go wherever it wanted to, whenever it wanted to, that would be a better thing. And that was terribly, terribly wrong. The absence of capital controls has been devastating for smaller economies. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but in these terms, we're classing Brazil as a smaller economy, because it means that capital flows in too fast and it leaves too fast. And so there is really an imperative, and the Brazilian government recognized this in the wake of during the financial crisis that began in 2008. It really is necessary and important to have the ability to control the flow of capital. That really begins to give you a measure of greater control over inflation and over the stability of the domestic economy. It is one step that can be taken in that direction. But more broadly, I just say that, there are no magic bullets here. It's not as if Brazil's economic problems or any nation's economic problems can all be addressed with some single shift in policy. It is rather a matter of addressing many different issues in a way that is more effective and organized around a set of principles, I think, and that begins to move you in the right direction.
Nós temos uma pergunta aqui da Maristela. All the literature about crisis of democracy talks about the reduction of GDP growth, increase of inequality, racism and xenophobia. Where is the question? Sérgio, você consegue localizar a pergunta dela para mim, por favor? Here. Should you say that from now on the solution would be a little more complex and involve more politics and other sciences, even in order to be possible to reduce misinformation and others' maladies?
So I think, thank you for the question. I think that economics has sometimes presented itself or been seen as sort of a super social science that can encompass all of the questions that policymakers need to answer and sort of provide a grand unified theory of government policy. And that overstates what economics can or should be. It is clear that we need to look at some of these problems through other lenses and to incorporate other systems of understanding. And it is also clear that we need to improve the lens of economics. So one great example of this is that GDP, the measurement of national economic growth, says nothing about the distribution of economic growth. It does not tell you whether everybody in a country is benefiting from increased prosperity, or whether, as is increasingly the case, those benefits are substantially concentrated in a very few rich people's pockets. And so if economics is giving policy advice on the basis of what will cause GDP to grow, that's not sufficient. It is necessary for policymakers also to evaluate how will that growth be distributed. Who will benefit from this? How many people? How much? And even that is insufficient, because beyond the lens of economics, we have other lenses of knowledge. So one very important one, I think, is psychologists have done some enormously compelling work showing that poverty, that inequality mimics the effects of poverty. In other words, even in a relatively wealthy nation, if there is a large gap between the rich and the poor, the effects of that on the poor, on their mental health, on their physical health, on the opportunities for their children, are very similar to a state of much greater absolute poverty. This is not a lesson you can learn from economics, but it is a lesson with consequences for policymakers. What it says is we need to be much more focused on the distribution of growth, not just on how fast an economy is growing, but on who is benefiting from that growth.
Eu perdi uma parte da pergunta da Maristela, que eu quero me desculpar com a Maristela, apesar eu acredito que a resposta de Appelbaum já está completa, mas eu vou ler o pedacinho, caso Appelbaum queira complementar com algo. Ela disse, during this transformation, the most frequent answer for the problems was, it's the economy, stupid. Appelbaum, você gostaria de complementar algo mais a partir desse comentário, ou acredita que está respondido já?
I actually was able to see the whole question on my screen, and so I was responding to the entirety of it.
Ok. Obrigada, Maristela. Então, deu tudo certo. Thomas Traumann, por favor, a palavra com você.
Bem, nós estamos aqui num momento, uma situação extremamente importante, que é essa situação de pandemia, e eu queria que você discutisse um pouco sobre como que você imagina que o mundo sai, economicamente falando, e em termos também de distribuição, como que ele sai dessa pandemia para os próximos anos. especialmente em do que a gente vai estar vendo com essa guerra das vacinas entre China e Estados Unidos, sobre quem vai ser o grande produto, o primeiro país a fazer as imunizações, etc. Eu queria que você falasse um pouco sobre esse pós-vacina, pós-pandemia, quando finalmente nós tivermos a pós-pandemia.
Important and timely questions. And I think it makes sense to speak about it on a couple of different dimensions. One trend that I find concerning is that we are seeing that large corporations are benefiting from or less harmed by the pandemic. So here in the United States, for example, Amazon, the big online retailer, is gobbling up market share as people turn to its delivery service to get the things that they need. Chain restaurants have been able to provide services to people that smaller family restaurants cannot. And so the chains are prospering and the family restaurants are going out of business. And this is true on a broader global level too. Companies with deeper pockets are in a better position to weather crises. Companies that have deeper pockets are in a better position to provide new kinds of services or services that are resilient to the crisis. And so, one of the problems in the economy in recent decades has been the concentration of corporate power and of wealth. And I think there is real reason to be concerned that we will see that increase during this period. Viruses kill people irrespective of how wealthy they are. But the virus needs to get to people first. And the sad truth is that lower income people and lower income countries confront much greater risks of infection and are not in as good a position to deal with the sick, to help people who are sick. And so on all of these dimensions, I think that there's a real risk that this health crisis exacerbates the economic inequalities that we've been talking about and that are such a problem for the modern economy. I think an important but more difficult question is what the impact of the pandemic is on the global economic landscape.
Yes.
Even before the crisis, we were seeing something of a modest retreat from globalization. We were seeing, nations demanding that companies onshore or bring back production to the home market. We were seeing, rising tensions between the United States and China, and between the United States and Europe, and between China and Europe, and across the landscape of global trade, we were seeing a period of resistance to the idea of the free production of goods across borders or the free distribution of services across borders. And so a long period of increased globalization, where with every passing year it seemed like the economies of nations were more intertwined, had hit at least a break point. We'll see how far it goes, and it was going to go into reverse, but it had at least stopped increasing. And I think there's a real risk that the pandemic increases that trend. I think that it has underscored for some nations their dependence on foreign suppliers for critical health supplies, or for other supplies that simply became unavailable because the pandemic was shutting factories in another country. It has underscored, I think, a sense among many political leaders that there is a national security element or a national interest in revitalizing domestic production in at least some industries. And that seems likely to further weigh against globalization in the coming period. One can also easily imagine continuing limitations on travel, or simply people, concluding that some types of travel and interchange are no longer necessary or desirable. And so I worry about a fraying of ties among nations. I worry that one of the things we know about viruses at the level of a community is that people tend to respond by pulling back from each other, and that viruses and plagues and epidemics of all kinds have a long history of fraying social connection and fraying ties, fraying a sense of solidarity. And I think there's a real risk that happens in the global community as well. And one reason I really worry about it is that we're at a critical moment for addressing global warming and climate change. There is as urgent a need as there has ever been for nations to work together on some of the issues we are confronting as a global community. And it comes at a moment when it may be harder for us to do that. And that's unfortunate.
Appelbaum, você acredita que os organismos internacionais, como a ONU, a OMS, que vem conduzindo esse processo sobre a pandemia, serão muito importantes também para regular essa volta e essas relações entre os países que você acabou de comentar?
I hope so. I think, we are just a couple of weeks away from a presidential election here in the United States, and I think there is a lot riding on the outcome, not just for us here in the United States, but for people around the world. The current president has made his disdain clear for international institutions like the World Health Organization. I think that if he is defeated and Joe Biden replaces him as president, you will likely see a restoration of America's commitment to these types of international organizations. Of course, even without the United States, these organizations will continue to function and to do important work, but they can only benefit from American engagement. I think it would be a big plus for the world if that is restored. But separate from what happens here, we absolutely need these types of, the world is more interconnected today than it has ever been. These problems, the ability of a virus to spread rapidly from a wet food market in China to the furthest corners of the globe is just one reminder of how close our lives are enmeshed with each other across international boundaries. Money moves across the world in the blink of an eye. Ideas move across the world in a blink of an eye. Images, entertainment, and also viruses, and also manufactured goods, and so these ties require regulation in order to work for us, and that regulation can only be provided by international organizations, and so I think their function is and remains critical.
Alison, a palavra está com você.
Obrigado, Érica. No seu livro, Binyamin, você faz uma comparação entre o Chile e Taiwan e afirma que esse país ele cresceu de uma forma diferente, baseada no governo, a economia cresceu baseada no governo e na industrialização. O que deu certo no Chile, o que deu errado e o que deu certo em Taiwan? Qual é a comparação entre esses dois países?
So I talked a little bit about this, but I think it's a really important and interesting contrast. So I chose to compare these two countries because they're both, in a way, islands. Chileans speak of their country as an island because of its isolation. And they were both economically isolated communities. And they sit basically on opposite sides of the world with the Pacific Ocean in between them. And they both, coming out of World War II, were poor countries with some differences. Chile had a much richer endowment of natural resources, but confronting a similar question of how they should interact then primarily with the United States and how they should chart their economic futures. And in Taiwan, the political leadership there made a series of important decisions. The first of which was to oversee a redistribution of agricultural land, a broad redistribution that essentially ensured that almost everyone in Taiwan had some property, had some land, enough to live on, and was in a position to use that land as collateral toward a child's education or toward starting a business. The government also worked very hard to shelter young industries, the textile industry at first, and then later, and famously, the electronics industry, the production of semiconductors in a growing and almost bewildering array of electronic goods over time. invested heavily in education, making high-quality education available at low cost, managed its currency very carefully, strenuously resisted the urging of the United States that the Taiwanese currency should be floated, that capital controls should be eliminated, insisted on pegging its currency to the United States for an extended period, and in all of these ways succeeded in nurturing an economic base that is now able to compete on even terms with the rest of the world. In Chile, by contrast, political reformers were unsuccessful in achieving any real redistribution of the land, and so land ownership remained intensely concentrated. Ownership of natural resources remained intensely concentrated. A rich elite controlled the country's economy. And while Chile was nominally a democracy in those decades, and Taiwan was very much a dictatorship, power in both countries was uncomfortably concentrated in a small number of hands. And in Chile, those in power resisted the country's economic development. They refused to invest in education for the masses. They refused to provide a route for people, talented young people, to move up and to make lives for themselves. And ultimately, what you saw in Chile was a period of profound political unrest in which first more leftist political leaders came to power and attempted to implement an agenda. And then there was, of course, a coup, and the military took control and embraced the advice of American economists, generally associated with the University of Chicago, to implement a set of free market principles that went beyond anything that had ever been implemented in the United States. It was like a laboratory for their experiments. It was the place where they said this, that they were literally able to do things that they couldn't do anywhere else. The free market economist Friedrich Hayek wrote a letter to Margaret Thatcher urging her to follow the example of Chile when she came to power in the United Kingdom. And she responded, "That's all well and good, but you couldn't possibly do those things in a democracy." And that was the cold hard truth of it, is that these economists imposed policies on Chile that never could have been attempted in a democracy. And they said it would be good. They said it would be good for the Chilean people, that this would benefit everyone, that getting rid of pensions and floating the currency and abandoning industrialization would be good for the country. And what it produced is indeed a very prosperous country, but a country in which that prosperity is intensely concentrated in the hands of a very few families who are, for the most part, still engaged in resource extraction. They grow salmon, they grow fruit, they mine copper. Chile, one of the most amazing things, I spent time in Chile in the course of writing my book, and for me, one of the most amazing things that I encountered while I was there is that the Norwegian shipping firm Maersk built a factory to build the refrigerated containers that it needs to ship Chilean fruit to Asia. And it figured that it might as well make the containers there. It's much cheaper to make them there. And the Chilean government celebrated this as evidence that its economy was finally moving beyond resource extraction, that it was beginning to provide higher value forms of economic activity. And the factory received massive government subsidies and closed after about 2 years because they found it, Maersk found it impossible to obtain the quality of workers that it needed or the quality of suppliers that it needed. Chile had so thoroughly destroyed its industrial base that it can no longer even build the containers that it needs to ship fruit to Asia. This is the difference in a nutshell. The Taiwanese were extremely careful not just to grow fruit, but to make the shipping containers and to build the ships and to finance the voyage. And in Chile, they took the short-term solution and focused on growing fruit and let someone else make the shipping container and someone else build the ship and someone else provide the financing. And you can see the results today.
Obrigada. Thomas Traumann, passo a palavra para você.
Sr. Appelbaum, no primeiro e até agora único debate entre o Biden, no momento o Biden fala sobre a questão climática e ele cita e ele falou na hipótese de que, bem, nós vamos, eventualmente, a gente vai ajudar ou liderar uma ajuda internacional em relação à Amazônia e para a proteção da Amazônia, ou o Brasil sofrerá as consequências. Não é a primeira vez que o Biden e o Partido Democrata criticam a Brasília em relação à Amazônia. É uma unanimidade mundial sobre a postura brasileira desde o governo Bolsonaro. Eu queria entender um pouco quanto que, na sua avaliação, isso é só um discurso geral, ou quanto, na sua avaliação, existe realmente uma possibilidade de sanções comerciais ao Brasil no futuro. E dois, quanto que essa imagem que o Brasil agora tem de ser um país que é um vilão ambiental, prejudicar a economia.
So I think that of villains, environmentally speaking, most nations, including the United States, are engaged in forms of environmental vandalism that are extremely problematic and consequential. And the way that we're going to need to move forward on climate change is for nations around the world to embrace a greater sense of responsibility for their own behavior and for the consequences of that behavior. Now, obviously, the Amazon rainforest is a singular natural resource. There is no substitute for it. The amount of carbon that it removes from the atmosphere is simply unparalleled and irreplaceable. And it is in the collective interest of everyone on Earth to preserve its capacity to do that important work. And frankly, you know, from an economic perspective, it's interesting to think about the value that it provides and how little of that value is you know, sort of in the market or realized by the market. This is the premise of policies like carbon markets, carbon taxation, sort of in reverse with a forest, is the idea that basically one way forward is to put a proper value on the resources that we need, and to make sure that you know, just as people who pollute pay for it, you know, resources that reduce pollution are paid for it. So this is a long way of saying that these problems are inherently international in character. And from the perspective of the United States, even if we were suddenly to muster the will to reduce carbon emissions in the United States to zero tomorrow, that would accomplish effectively nothing in terms of slowing the pace of global warming. If any nation gets to carbon zero tomorrow, it accomplishes effectively nothing. The only way we move forward is by finding ways of coming together and working together to reduce carbon emissions. And you know, one possible avenue to get there, in theory, is for countries to wield sticks and to threaten other countries that if they don't cooperate, they will be punished for intransigence. But I have to tell you that I have grave doubts about the efficacy of that approach, not just with respect to Brazil, but in general. It seems to me that the only likely way that we succeed here is if Brazilians take responsibility for Brazil, and Americans take responsibility for America, and Nigerians take responsibility for Nigeria. Do I foresee that the US government would attempt to force Brazil's hand? I don't. I don't see any sign that that's imminent or under real consideration. But even if I thought that it was an issue that was being discussed here, I would think that it was a bad idea. Because I think that, you know, nations as sovereign entities ultimately need to feel and act on a responsibility for this. And the solution to Brazilians burning the Amazon is for Brazilians to stop burning the Amazon.
Okay, I agree.
Você acredita que essa dificuldade de uma união, de uma conversa, viria de um sentimento nacionalista que podem surgir agora nesse momento, pós-pandemia, onde todos os países querem proteger os seus mercados e resolver os seus problemas, comprar as suas vacinas? Esse sentimento poderia se contrapor a essa consciência? Como motivar a quebrar esse sentimento?
With respect to the environment, so I think that there are two issues. One is just the basic sense of sovereignty and nationalism that is so common in nations around the world, and the sense of, we'll take care of our own affairs, leave us alone. But I think there's another issue too that deserves to be spotlighted, which is that there's a genuine sense of the unfairness of nations that have succeeded in developing, telling other nations to arrest their development. Just as there's a basic sense of unfairness in nations that have the infrastructure to develop vaccines, dictating the terms of its use to nations that are not in the position to do that for themselves. So there are these inequities in the global community that you need to find ways. I think that the way forward is to find ways of addressing those inequities that convince people that the system is equitable, that basically, if you want to reduce pollution in developing nations, you need to provide alternative means of generating both electricity in the immediate sense and prosperity in the broader sense. It needs to feel like, the loss of coal power in China is not going to cripple the development of the Chinese economy, that the loss of the Amazon, that the preservation of the Amazon in Brazil is not going to cripple the development of the Brazilian economy, that it's not simply a situation in which nations that have become very wealthy, just to pick on something other than the United States, Norway, which has pocketed an absolute fortune from the sale of oil. Norway used to be a very poor country. Norway and Chile were in many respects economically similar, and the one was not any richer than the other. And what Norway has done is it found oil and pumped it out of the ground and sold it around the world to be burned, to pollute the environment. And now Norway is an extraordinarily wealthy nation that looks around the world and says, hey, we are green here in Norway, and the rest of you should behave too. Well, that's not going to work. In order for us to move forward, Norway needs to understand that its wealth was created by the problem that we're now trying to solve, and that sharing that wealth needs to be a part of the solution to that problem. And I don't mean to pick on Norway. The same is true for other developed nations, but it can't just be that there's a demand for solutions from the developing world. There also needs to be a sharing of resources and prosperity.
Obrigada, Alison. Palavra para sua pergunta.
Em editorial publicado neste mês, a Financial Times anunciou que a austeridade foi oficialmente enterrada e que não devemos chorar a sua morte. Segundo esse editorial, os déficits fiscais aumentaram muito desde a pandemia e a dívida pública global aí atingindo 100% do produto interno bruto, e governos gastando muito dinheiro para conter a devastação que a Covid-19 causou. Mesmo países conhecidos por uma política de austeridade econômica, como a Alemanha, estão gastando bastante dinheiro. O próprio FMI tem afirmado que o aperto fiscal prematuro após a crise prejudicará e não curará as economias. Você nos deu hoje aqui algumas pistas importantes sobre o papel que você acredita que o Estado deve ter durante a pandemia. Eu gostaria de saber como você pensa esse papel do Estado no pós-pandemia, e que tipo de política econômica você acredita que deverá prevalecer na maior parte dos países capitalistas.
Yeah, good question. Thank you. So I think that the death of, it's probably premature to claim that austerity as a philosophy has been laid to rest. I worry that we're actually very much at a moment with parallels to, sort of after the first phase of the 2008 crisis, when many governments initially responded aggressively and then came together in 2010 at the G20 meetings that year in the United States and issued this consensus document in which they all said basically, okay, we're done now. Now it's time for austerity. I don't expect that to be replayed exactly, but I think that it's premature to conclude that nations will stay the course and continue to make the necessary investments to ensure a speedy recovery from this disaster. I should step back one more step, actually, and say that until the public health problem is under control, economic policy is a secondary consideration, because we're not going to see an economic revival until we have provided through a vaccine or through better public health policies, or both in all probability, a better degree of control of the virus. But once that's accomplished, governments are going to need to be ready to open up their checkbooks in order to revive economic growth. And I think there's really an opportunity here. I think there's a lesson from the last time, which was only a decade ago. And we saw that austere policies resulted in slow growth and in years and years of economic pain that was substantially avoidable if governments had been more aggressive. And I think many politicians today are aware of that and have been more aggressive to this point, and hopefully will continue to be more aggressive. But beyond that, I think that there's an opportunity for governments, not just the way that you spend the money matters. And there's an opportunity here for governments not simply to try to prop up the system as it now exists, but to look at their economies and say, how do we want to change? And what do we want to incentivize? So in the United States, there's a lot of talk around investment in the development of renewable energy resources, which I think is the type of thing that nations can productively invest in to generate faster economic growth with other benefits as well. The benefits including a more even distribution of prosperity and obviously reduced harm to the environment. So I think, it's terrible that the world is experiencing a second economic crisis just, about a decade after the last one. But one benefit of that unusual and painful circumstance is that it has often been the case historically that you have an economic crisis and then the economy rebounds and roughly a generation passes before the next cataclysm. And by the time things start to fall apart again, everybody has forgotten the lessons of the last time. And one advantage and opportunity that we have this time around, I hope, is that the lessons are still so fresh from what happened in 2008 and in the years after that, that we have a better chance of taking those lessons and of responding more effectively to the current crisis. And hopefully that piece that you mentioned proves prescient, and it is indeed the case that governments recognize the need to invest in economic growth.
Thomas Traumann, mais uma pergunta.
Era exatamente sobre as lições. Você acha que as lições de 2008 elas estão suficientemente aprendidas, especialmente em relação à falta de regulação dos mercados? Ou seja, no final a pergunta é: nós vamos sair dessa segunda crise do século XXI melhores ou mais inteligentes do que nós entramos?
I think it's an open question. So I think, as in the 1930s and the 1970s, we are living through a period in which there has been a loss of confidence in a regime of economic policy. The way that we thought the economy worked turns out to be wrong. The way that we'd been managing the economy turns out to be ineffective and in important respects disastrous. So we've learned what doesn't work. But the real challenge we're now confronting is to develop an alternative, to articulate a new set of rules for the management of the economy. And I think that, we're in a period of considerable intellectual ferment and uncertainty. Countries are trying a lot of different things. There is some consistency, obviously, but also a lot of open questions. And the real challenge is for a new paradigm to emerge, a new sense of the role of the state in the economy. A real sense that the economy is actually inside of the state, that it needs to be managed by the state, that we need intelligent regulation, that we need investment, that we need a strong safety net, a social safety net. These things are all critical elements in what I think a new paradigm needs to look like, but I don't have any confidence that it has emerged yet. It is my hope that we will emerge from this crisis in better shape than we entered it. It is my hope that policymakers will take the lesson and say, okay, here's how we need to move forward. But I think that there is still much work to do to articulate an intellectual framework, to disseminate it, to refine it, to convince people that we now have a new and better understanding of what is necessary in order to produce sustained prosperity. I don't think we're there yet. I think it's a big project that is underway, but is very uncertain. And one can easily imagine much less desirable outcomes. We're seeing right now a competition between, the type of nationalist, ignorant isolationism represented by Donald Trump, which I like to think of as turtle economics, sort of the belief that you can crawl into your shell and ignore the rest of the world and everything will be okay. We are seeing countries around the world back political leaders who full-heartedly subscribe to that worldview. And there's no reason to have confidence that they'll lose, except if people, resist and insist on a different paradigm.
Appelbaum, nós vamos caminhando para as considerações finais e eu gostaria de fazer junto uma última pergunta. Como houve um momento em que surgiu a hora dos economistas, nós estamos agora num novo momento de repensarmos qual grupo virá para ser o melhor para a sociedade. É um momento de transição?
I think this is an open question. I think that there are examples that I regard as hopeful, even inspiring. I think that, we have seen, there are younger economists whose work is rooted in a very different tradition than has prevailed over the last half century. People who are articulating an understanding of the importance of the distribution of prosperity, who are trying to understand what it means to have an economy that is not simply growing in the aggregate, but that is actually producing broad-based opportunity for people to realize their own goals and to live fulfilled lives with adequate resources and support, to actually enjoy the freedoms to which they are entitled. And I think that there are exciting ideas that we're seeing explored and even in some places implemented. And so there is reason for hope that a new economics will emerge and that new economics will be seated in a recognition of its own limitations, so that other forms of social science and human knowledge will also inform policymaking, and that economists will be helpful, but no longer insistent on their own omniscience, on their own ability to answer every question and to solve every problem. So it could be the beginning of a move in a new and a better direction, and I hope that it is. But I worry that it's not, and I think really the balance, the matter hangs in the balance at the moment, and much depends on convincing people to have faith in the ability of government to improve their lives.
Ok. Binyamin Appelbaum, muito obrigada. Estamos ansiosos para termos a tradução do seu livro, a versão em português, aqui também para nós. E eu passo a palavra para os nossos convidados, para a sua despedida e considerações finais também. Thomas Traumann, com você a palavra.
Quero agradecer muito, Érica, muito convite, agradecer ao Appelbaum. Primeiro, eu acho que esse seu livro ele é uma rápida e muito inteligente história do pensamento econômico do século XX, e eu espero que quando ele for traduzido, muitas mais pessoas terão a oportunidade de lê-lo. Mas eu queria também agradecer o fato de você ter saído não só do livro, mas ter também avançado por outros temas sobre a situação econômica atual e para o futuro. Era isso que eu queria dizer. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada, Alison.
Binyamin, Quero agradecer a você, ao Thomas, a Érica também, em nome de toda a diretoria do Sindilegis, em nome também dos nossos mais de 10 mil servidores filiados. Foi um prazer tê-lo aqui conosco nesse programa, ouvir um pouco o seu pensamento sobre a economia, a teoria liberal, e foi muito rico. Agradecer também aqui ao meu amigo Luiz Quimaide, CEO da Bússola Tech, que conseguiu nos colocar em contato, e agradecer principalmente a todos aqueles que nos acompanharam até esse presente momento.
Bem, nós tivemos problema aqui com a tradução, mas o Sindilegis vai depois colocar esse debate no ar com uma versão traduzida para que todos que não puderam acompanhar agora possam entender tudo depois. A todos que estiveram aqui conosco, muito obrigada. Aos nossos convidados, eu também agradeço. E mais uma vez, Binyamin Appelbaum, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
E eu estava muda? Será que eu estava...
Não, estava não. Deu para ouvir você.